Hello everyone and welcome back to Creation Myths. Today we are going to talk about how Dr. Michael Behe is definitely lying. And if you know what I do here and how I generally approach these things, you know that it takes me a while. It takes a lot of evidence for me to come out and straight up say, this person is lying. I like to assume that people are engaging in good faith. I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, even creationists. A lot of times that's not warranted, and I've had a lot of people tell me over the years that I'm being too generous, and I just need to acknowledge that they're just lying. And you know what? Fair enough. And a lot of people, I think fairly, have been at that point with Dr. Michael Behe for a long time. To be fair, I think I'm kind of one of them. This is not a new realization to me, but something popped up this week that really drove the point home, and I want to talk about that here today. So today we are talking about this article on Evolution News. So this is the Discovery Institute blog. They publish a bunch of articles over the course of a week, multiple per day usually. So this one is called Darwinism is a Potemkin Theory of Evolution. This is from April 25th, 2025. And the first thing I want to point out here, something that I've pointed out over and over again, including in my conversation with Dr. Michael Behe from like 5 years ago, Darwinism. Darwinism is not anything that anybody in evolution uses anymore, right? Darwinian evolution is from 1859. We've added stuff to it and changed it since then. Darwin got some stuff right, like natural selection. That's a real thing. But he also got some stuff wrong, like how inheritance works. And with the advent of like molecular biology and genetics, we've learned a whole lot since then. So Darwinism in no way represents the modern theory of evolution in the 21st century. But Michael Behe and plenty of other creationists, and in particular the intelligent design proponents, they love to use Darwinism and use Darwin as the boogeyman. So right off the bat, the framing of this whole article is going to be dishonest. But let me tell you, it gets so much worse. So we're going to go through this article. We're not going to go line by line, but I'm going to pick out some important parts to show how Behe sets up his argument and then how he dishonestly goes about making his case. So we'll pull up excerpts and I'll highlight and read the key parts. So let's get into this pile of nonsense. Behe starts, "Headlines about evolution can give you whiplash. Was Darwin wrong?" teased a cover of National Geographic in 2004. But turn the page and you're conked over the head. No, the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. Now jump to a recent book review in the journal Nature. A new vision for how evolution works is long overdue. It challenges a dearly held orthodoxy among evolutionary biologists. How could the evidence have been overwhelming, but now orthodoxy is being challenged? So this is his setup. And this right away just ignores how science works, right? We're always changing and adding and tweaking to any theoretical framework. This is happening, with physics, with Newton, and then Einstein, and now quantum theory, right? We're always revising the dominant theory as we learn new things. And this is always happening with evolution too. In particular, in the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st century, with the advent of genomics and sequencing technologies that are very fast and cheap, we can just gather tons more data, which gives us way more information about things like genome evolution. So now we're able to revise how we think about those things. Does that mean that the stuff we learned about before, like natural selection and mutations and genetic drift and everything leading up to that point, was wrong? No, it means we have a better, more complete understanding than we used to do. And I'm going to point something out here for the first time in this article and not for the last time. All that stuff that I just said, Behe knows that stuff, because he is a real scientist with a real pre-intelligent design scientific career. He is a biochemist who earned a legitimate PhD and did legitimate research. He knows how science works and how theoretical frameworks evolve. He's just dishonestly presenting it as something different from that in the case of evolution in order to support his preferred flavor of creationism. Behe then writes, the aspect of Darwin's theory that confounds most people, stick with me here, is that it tries to account for opposite features of creatures, their similarities and their differences. In other words, yeah, we're trying to explain the evolutionary history of lineages, which will share some similarities and also be distinct in some ways, and we want to explain both of those things, right? Okay, yes, we are trying to explain both of those things. I don't know why that's like a problem or a sticking point, though. Yes, we're explaining various aspects of how things got the way they are through different evolutionary mechanisms and principles. He says that similarities are the easy part. We all know that babies look like their parents. Well, suppose that for some odd reason, over many generations, the descendants of one of the kids and his wife gradually started to change in some way. Couple things I want to point out here. First, the social conservatism. Has to be wife, can't just be two randos mating, have to be a married couple in order to have kids. That's the Christian nationalism, traditional marriage stuff creeping in here. But also, the big thing I want to point out here is suppose for some odd reason, that changes happen in offspring. What do you mean for some odd reason, Mike? We know how changes happen through evolution, right? You've got recombination, you've got mutation, you've got horizontal gene transfer. We know how new things occur in a lineage, right? We don't have to present this as, oh, we don't know how new something's going to happen, some odd reason. We know how these things happen. Right? He goes on to say, even though both lineages, right, the one with the new thing and something else, right? Even though both lineages acquired some differences, other parts might still look like those of the original parents. The similarities, the parts that stayed the same, would be due to descent from a common ancestor. Yes, in general, that is the case. When you have closely related lineages that share traits, those traits are present in the common ancestor and have been inherited in both of those lineages. Yes, that is a reasonable summary of that principle of evolution. He then says that sounds reasonable, mostly because it's trivial. All the notion of common descent says is that resemblances were already there in the ancestor and the descendants inherited them. And I'm sure you could see exactly where this is going. It doesn't even try to explain where the ancestors came from, or how they got the original features, or how any differences between the two lineages arose. Yes, you know this. Michael Behe knows that that's the case, right? If we're looking at common ancestry, for example, between humans and chimps, we're going to look at things like, for example, an opposable thumb, right? Or development patterns, the formation of the central nervous system through the process of neurulation. These processes are the same because they were inherited from a common ancestor. We can't use the same explanation to explain the differences between humans and chimpanzees. Obviously, we have to use other evolutionary mechanisms to explain those differences. Things like, for example, resource partitioning and competitive exclusion that led to one lineage of apes moving from forests into grasslands and subsequently adapting to that new environment. And then, of course, creationists like Behe would say, oh, but how did they adapt to the new environment? Because traits have variation. Right? And some individuals would be taller than others, and some would have a slightly more upright posture than others in terms of how they got around. And the ones that were taller and had a more upright posture through mutations and regulatory changes during development and other evolutionary mechanisms, you end up selecting for those so that population ends up walking on two legs, right? These are well understood processes that Behe is just ignoring to make it look like we don't actually understand how evolutionary changes occur. That's what's going on here, folks. He goes on to say, differences can be the very, very hard part. Differences demand answers to the bottom line question, how in the Sam Hill could such a fantastic thing happen? The killer question is, what could build cool new features, such as bats flying or whales living in the ocean? What could drive the construction of animals that had never been seen on Earth? It's right about here that Darwin boosters go mute. And this is right here. When I was reading this article, this is where the switch flipped. It was right here. It was bad enough already up to this point, but it was that line. It's right about here that Darwin boosters go mute that I said to myself, wow, this dude is full of it. I may have used slightly different words when I said that phrase. He's clearly just lying here, because to say that when you ask how do new traits evolve, like bat wings or whale flippers, how do those new traits evolve? And to say that Darwin boosters go mute at that question means either you're lying or you have not taken the time at all for Dr. Michael Behe's nearly 30 years of writing about this, or over 30 years writing about this. His famous book came out in 1996. He was working on this stuff before then. He's been doing this for over 30 years. I will not insult his intelligence nor his knowledge by saying that he is ignorant of all of the writing that has been done in the field of evolutionary biology on the evolution of new traits. I will not insult Michael Behe by saying he does not know about that robust part of the literature. He clearly knows that that stuff exists, right? So if you were to go on Google Scholar or something, right, and you were to look up bat wing evolution, how do wings evolve? How did whales evolve to be marine? You're going to find literal books answering those questions. This is kind of a trick Michael Behe has been doing for decades, and it bit him in the butt very famously at the Kitzmiller v. Dover intelligent design trial in 2005, where I believe the topic at that point was blood clotting, and he said there has been no evolutionary explanation for the evolution of blood clotting, to which the attorney questioning him piled up in front of him books on that very topic, stacks of books and scientific papers addressing the very question he said that was not being addressed. That was in the fall of 2005. It is the spring of 2025, nearly 20 years later, and Behe is still telling the same lies. That Darwinists not only don't have an answer for how new traits evolve, but don't even want to talk about it. I teach evolutionary biology every year. I teach a 200-level evolutionary biology course, and we spend an entire day of class on how do new traits evolve. That is a topic for one of the days of class during the semester. We go through various mechanisms of how you can recruit proteins that do one job to have a different job. Processes like neo-functionalization and subfunctionalization, gene duplication and horizontal gene transfer. These are not questions that are foreign to evolutionary biologists. We talk about this stuff all the time, and it's one of the big things that evolutionary biologists investigate. And going further than that, because I'm sure that Behe's response, or many creationists would respond to what I just said and say, oh, sure, you can explain microevolution, but what about macroevolution? If you're a creationist and you're watching this and you had that thought just then, I challenge you to go Google the phrase genome evolution. Go look it up. You're going to find answers to how large-scale traits evolve. Go check it out. I dare you. Behe, of course, doesn't care about any of that stuff because he's stuck in the 1850s. He writes, the stumbling block is that the mechanism Darwin proposed to account for differences, natural selection, sifting random mutations, is quite the feeble tool. It can only work, in Darwin's words, by numerous successive slight modifications. And this is another example of a gross misrepresentation of the field of evolutionary biology. Why are we talking about the mechanism Darwin proposed? The whole point is that we're saying, does evolution as a theory, right, as a field of biology have answers to these questions? Why is he saying the tool that was proposed in the mid-1800s can't answer those questions? What about everything else that's happened since then, Mike? Does all evolution occur by numerous successive slight modifications? Is that how, evolutionary biologists, like me, think about evolutionary change, one little mutation at a time in a linear sequence? I don't think so. And I know you don't think so either, because again, you've been doing this for decades. You know other mechanisms of evolution that go well beyond what Darwin proposed in 1859. Heck, Darwin even talked about some of them in his later works. But here you are presenting this as though we haven't moved past the 1800s. He continues on this, and as I read this next excerpt here, you'll see that this is basically just running up to the concept of irreducible complexity, which he doesn't specifically name check here, but that's what he's talking about, right? He says, just try to think up a realistic way to retool a computer-controlled factory that is making cars into one that makes helicopters or submarines. One nut or bolt, one line of computer code, one tiny random alteration in the factory at a time. That's the magnitude of the problem facing Darwinian explanations for bats and whales and many other creatures. Fortunately, we have non-Darwinian explanations, because the field of evolutionary biology didn't stop figuring stuff out in 1859 or 1872 or whenever, right? Turns out we actually learned a lot more, especially once we got to the 20th century and we figured out a little thing called genetics. And then we had the field of population genetics, pair that with molecular biology. Now we start getting into like the structure of DNA, and now we can really get going because we understand at the molecular level what's happening. Behe has an answer for that too. He continues, how did most biologists come to believe that Darwin solved the riddle of life despite the limpness of his theory? A campaign of arm twisting from about 1930 to 1950 curdled an abstract, mathematized version of Darwin's theory dubbed neo-darwinism into place in academia as the default explanation for evolution. Since math can be intimidating, neo-darwinism has been entrenched there ever since, handed down from professor to graduate student entirely through intellectual inertia. The degree of dishonesty packed into that paragraph is astonishing. You'll notice there's nothing about any research that happened in the early 20th century, the advent of the field of genetics and population genetics. No, none of that. It was a campaign of arm twisting that led to the formation of neo-Darwinism, or the modern synthesis, in the mid-approximately 20th century. Right? The whole point here is this is actually a huge advance. This was a giant leap forward for the theoretical framework of evolution because it quantified the field. Once you had population genetics, you could make specific predictions about how natural species, natural populations, natural lineages should exist. And then you can go out and check those predictions and see if you were right. And it turns out over and over again, we're right about stuff. We can accurately predict what's going to happen mathematically, and then go out and check our work and see that it happens that way, showing that the underlying theoretical framework is valid. That's the point of the mathematizing of the theory of evolution in the early to mid 20th century. That's the big boon that we got out of it. But Behe just writes this off. Math can be intimidating. Nobody wants to question it. Are you kidding me? There's literally journals about population genetics, which is a mathematical field. There are journals about mathematical biology and computational biology. I've done some of this stuff. Half my PhD dissertation was computational. The idea that people don't want to do math and so we just kind of go along to get along because biologists are scared of numbers is ridiculous. I tell this to all of my students. I know you find calculus difficult. You don't want to take statistics and probability and all the math stuff. You just have to do your prerequisites, your requirements to graduate. But I try to convey to all my students, despite the fact that however you feel about math, you need math for biology, and in particular for evolution. It is a robustly mathematical field, and that's a good thing. There's also an idea embedded in this paragraph that the theory hasn't changed much since about 1950, which is banana pants. I have no idea of any possible explanation for this other than Behe is just lying to your face. If you're reading this as like someone who just peruses evolution news, Behe is lying to you straight up. Because what you're getting here is the presentation, right? The representation that the field kind of ossified in 1950 or so and hasn't changed since. I mean, my goodness, all of the things in the field of biology and evolution that we didn't understand in the 1950s. As Behe goes on to say, we didn't know the structure of DNA. One of my favorite aspects of it, neutral theory, didn't pop up until decades later, right, and really matured in the 1970s. You had genomics and DNA sequencing, phylogenetic techniques, right? None of this stuff existed in the 1950s, right? So to present evolutionary theory as stopping in 1950 is profoundly dishonest. And I know Michael Behe knows better. He just presents it as though Darwinism hasn't incorporated any of them. He writes, notice that this occurred before the greatest discoveries of modern biology, before the understanding of what a gene consists of, before Watson and Crick's work on DNA, before the realization that proteins form cellular machines, before the cracking of the genetic code, and much more. In the ensuing years, precisely zero of those astounding discoveries has been accounted for in terms of Darwin's theory by anything other than cartoonist just-so stories. That paragraph, again, is astonishing in its dishonesty, because what he's packing into here is saying, hey, we've discovered a lot since neo-Darwinism was put together in, by the mid-20th century. But none of that matters for evolution. Are you kidding me? Right? He knows that we've discovered all these new things like genomics and epigenetics and neutral theory, right? He knows all of this new stuff happened. He's just pretending that it has nothing to do with evolution, or that evolution has not incorporated it or been able to incorporate it, which is ridiculous. We've absolutely incorporated this stuff into evolutionary theory. I know this because I'm an evolutionary biologist. I'm an evolutionary biologist, so I'll tell you all the stuff that Behe here is saying we haven't considered in terms of the theory of evolution. We have. One of my favorite papers of all time is about the evolution of the genetic code and why RNA uses uracil and DNA uses thymine. It's beautiful. It's one of my favorite papers of all time. I love it, and it is explaining one of the most basic aspects of living things, the structure of the genetic material, the actual molecule itself, in terms of evolution. By the way, for anyone curious, that paper is called Confounded Cytosine, Tinkering in the Evolution of DNA, and I'll link that paper below. It's legitimately one of my favorite papers of all time. So then Behe talks a bit about the extended evolutionary synthesis. He says the colossal and growing mismatch between life's observed sophistication and Darwin's crude mechanism has pushed a restless minority of biologists to cast about for anything more plausible. The motley notions are often grouped under an umbrella term as the extended evolutionary synthesis. And he goes on for a bit to basically talk about how the extended evolutionary synthesis is kind of silly. And man, another reason to be mad at the EES people is they make me, for one brief moment in time, agree with Michael Behe, because yes, the extended evolutionary synthesis is mostly very silly and unserious and not well supported by evidence. God, how dare you, EES people, making me actually, just a teeny little bit, agree with Michael Behe. The nerves, it's unforgivable. So Behe goes through some of the EES kind of ideas, and one that I want to just point out for a second here is this idea of natural genetic engineering. He writes, advocates of NGE point out that many of the tools molecular biologists use to manipulate DNA in a lab, to clone it, sequence it, and so on, are harvested from life, because cells are already endowed with a sophisticated box of tools to build and propagate life. But the elegant tools are already there. Where did they come from? Here's what he is missing when he's making his point here. And first of all, I agree that the EES natural genetic engineering stuff is silly because cells can't pick to evolve I'm going to do this trait. No. To the extent that natural genetic engineering is a real thing, basically what the cells are doing is generating lots of variation. They're sampling more of sequence space, to use terms that you would find in the field of evolutionary biology, and that enables them to find new traits more efficiently, new traits that might be beneficial in a particular context. Here's the funny thing about this, though. Behe's talking about this stuff. He doesn't realize that this is one of the answers to the thing that he said we don't have an answer for earlier, right? To the extent that their natural genetic engineering is a thing, which, for example, organisms can trigger recombination of their genes in some cases. They can increase their mutation rate in some cases. In some species, you could even modulate the mutation rate in a region-specific way. Now, none of these mechanisms allow an organism to say, I'm going to evolve this trait. Right? You can't purposefully pick a target and then evolve to that target. You can't do that. But what it does let you do is try out more things, right? You're generating more variation and you're trying out new things. To the extent that that's what organisms are able to do, that's an answer to the question Behe asked before, how do you evolve new stuff? And he claims that Darwinists don't want to talk about it. But then he goes later on and he talks about one of the proposed mechanisms. Which is it, dude? Do we not want to talk about it? Or are the mechanisms we're proposing incorrect? Can't be both, right? Pick one, please. Thank you. And then, of course, he does the move the goalpost, but how did these things get there? Which is different from the question he originally posed, right? He says, here's a proposed answer to the question of how do you get new things? And rather than say, but that doesn't work, he moves the goalpost to say, but how did that thing get there? Everyone see the trick that he's pulling with this? It's pretty subtle by the standards of creationists, but it's a very common trick and you should always be on the lookout for it. So he wraps this up by saying other EES ideas go completely off the rails. And once again, I have to say, come on, extended synthesis people. You guys are so out there, you're making me agree with Michael Behe, and I find that completely unforgivable. How dare you? Extended synthesis people, get it together. Stop making Michael Behe say things that are accurate. Ridiculous. And then he finishes this part by saying, and these are the best alternatives to a moribund Darwinism, which is great because he just completely ignores like the real field of evolution and then cherry picks the cranks and says, this is the best they got, which is, again, an extremely dishonest presentation of how this field operates. So Michael Behe wraps up this article with this section titled The Thin Facade of Darwinism. He writes, as a succession of sages over the centuries wrestled futilely with the question of what mechanism could possibly account for the elegant structures of life, various monikers have been attached to the notion of evolution. Lamarck's theory, Darwin's theory, neo-Darwinism, the modern synthesis, the extended evolutionary synthesis. Those are different things. With the exception of neo-Darwinism and the modern synthesis, those are all different things, right? Lamarck, Darwin, and then neo-Darwinism and the modern synthesis and extended evolutionary synthesis are all referring to different theoretical frameworks for how evolution works. Darwin's theory and then the modern synthesis, that is a continuum of progress of increased and improved understanding of how this process of evolution works. It's mechanistically and theoretically different from what Lamarck proposed and what's being proposed by the extended evolutionary synthesis people. Behe doesn't care about any of that. He's just, again, dishonestly, because there's no other possible explanation here, lumping all of these things together. And I'm confident saying it is dishonesty rather than ignorance because I could not possibly insult Michael Behe's intelligence and knowledge by proposing that he thinks that Lamarck and Darwin and extended synthesis and neo-Darwinism are all the same thing. There's no way that man genuinely thinks that's the case, which means he's lying. And he wraps up with this. The reality is that no matter what headline you may read, the prospects for a mechanistic accounting of the unfolding of life remain as distant now as they ever were, which in 2025 is an absolutely unhinged thing to write. Our understanding of evolutionary processes right now is astonishing compared to 100 years ago, 50 years ago, even 25 years ago, right? At just the cusp of the field of genomics. We understand so much more than we did back then. To say that we've made no progress and an actual mechanistic description of how these processes occur is as distant now as it was, for example, when Darwin published Origin of Species in 1859, that is completely crazy. Our understanding now is no better than before the field of genetics existed, before we knew what DNA was and how it works. Think about that for like 5 seconds. It's lines like that that make it clear that Michael Behe is definitely lying. So that's it for this one, folks. Thank you all for watching. Please remember to like, subscribe, leave a comment, share this video, and if you are so inclined, if you want to support what I'm doing here, consider becoming a channel member. When I get ahead of my schedule and I'm able to record things a little bit in advance, channel members get immediate access to my uploaded videos instead of having to wait for the public release. So thank you all once again for watching, and don't get fooled.